Good to join you, brothers and sisters at Westside. We'll be studying this quarter, April through June, the chapters in the book of Genesis, the book of beginnings, chapters 12 through 50. Last year, Jeff Sprott taught Genesis 1 through 11, so we're not going to recover that material, but we'll pick up with what are called the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the very different block of material that's called the story of Joseph. Joseph is not one of the patriarchs, son of Jacob, one of the patriarchs, but he is not. And yet he is a very integral part of the story. He takes up a huge section of the block of material that's in 12 through 50. But anyway, we'll get to all of that as we get down through our study. Remember that Genesis is divided into the two sections, chapters 1 through 11, 12 through 50. 1 through 11 concern thousands of years of time. We don't even know how much to put into that category, what we call primeval history. There are four main sections in the first division of that book. You have creation, of course. You have the fall of man, sin entering the world. You have the judgment of God upon the very wicked world in the days of Noah with the Noachian flood. And then you have Noah's sons that were to be dispersed in the world, populate the world, all congregate at Babel, and because of that, God confounded their language, and of course the nations were formed by God in that they could not speak the same language. So you have those four distinct sections in that first division. The second division has four sections too. You have the story of Abraham, which will cover a little bit of chapter 11 verse 27 through all the way through chapter 25, and then you have Isaac, Jacob, and then the story of Joseph. The patriarchs, of course, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that word means father rule. And of course, that had extended all the way back to the beginning of time. Adam was dealt with directly by God. Noah was the same. All the ones that you see in that section, it means father rule. The word patri for Greek and Latin is father, and ark is the Greek word that means to rule. Like we have monarch, for instance. Mono means one, so the rule of a king, one ruler. Democracy, you have demos, people, and the ark word again meaning the rule of the people. So God dealt directly with the family heads, and as one man would die, Abraham, Isaac, his son, his eldest son, would take his place, and so forth. And that's how God dealt with mankind in this age that's called the patriarchal age. So we begin the story of Abraham. Abraham is in Ur of the Chaldees when we first see him. That is in modern-day Iraq at the very tip of the Persian Gulf, where Kuwait is now, and Iraq, if you're thinking of that area on the modern map. Abram, Nahor, and Haran are taken by their father Terah up to Haran, okay, same name as one of the sons, and that's the very far north of what is called the Fertile Crescent. All right, so we're real high tech here. This is a picture of the Fertile Crescent, and as you can see, it's shaped in a crescent area. To go across from Palestine, from the Mesopotamian region all the way across to Palestine, you'd have to cross the Arabian Desert. While there was a trade route that went that way, it was very, very dangerous kind of endeavor with very, very few, a lot of water that had to be carried and so forth, very few oases. The main avenue of travel was to follow up the ark and come down all the way into Egypt. So the trade routes did that. I want you to note where Elam is. That will play a role in the story today. So this is modern Iraq today, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Mesopotamia means between the river. And this is the area in the region where Abram, as we know him in the early part of the story, Abraham originated. Right, Ur of the Chaldees will be down in this area near the Persian Gulf, and Haran is up at the top where we see Assyria here, and so that is where they will travel until they go to the land of Palestine. All right, so in chapter 12, beginning at verse 1, there in Haran, and Terah dies, and the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, this is not called a covenant at this point, but it's exactly what God is making with Abraham or Abram. It is going to be called a covenant, and the same promises are made in chapter 15 and in chapter 17. It's going to be reiterated today in chapter 13 when Lot separates from, and they go their separate ways, but we'll get into that as we get there. So remember that this is a very important covenant. It concerns all humanity when he says, and in you all nations of the earth will be blessed. And that part of the covenant is what we call the messianic promise, the promise of Jesus Christ, who would descend physically from Abraham through the peoples that would produce, and finally through Judah, who is the son of Jacob, being the grandson of Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Judah would be the tribe through which the Messiah would come. The other two promises, of course, are that he will make Abraham into a great nation. That, of course, is given to a man whose wife is barren, and he has no progeny of his own. He has no son that has come from himself and his wife. But they are promised that they will have a great nation. So you have the seed promise or the offspring promise of the Messiah. You have the fact they'll have a great nation, and then, of course, they will have a great land. And that land is what we call Canaan, where modern Israel is today, the land of Palestine. So when he is in Haran, he is told to go from his father's house and to the land that he would show him. Abraham is 75 years old, by the way, when this happens. Verse 4 tells us that. We could say it this way: he's no spring chicken. He's not straight out of college with all the zest of life and wanting to embark on that kind of journey. But nonetheless, he is a man of great faith. He is the father of the faithful in the Word of God, meaning both Jew and Gentile. In Romans, the 4th chapter, Paul calls him the father of all of us who believe in Jesus. His family, however, when he is in Ur of the Chaldees, Haran, are idolaters, and some of that idolatry is going to follow through. We'll see it in some of the family members on down through the stories that we read. Joshua makes mention of this when he gives his departing speech, his last speech in the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 2. He refers to the fact that by name, Terah and his fathers served other gods. Most likely Abraham did too, until Abram believed in the true and living God when God called him to go on this great journey. And you think about the faith that it would take, the kind of faith that puts him in the hall of faith. Remember in the Hebrews 11th chapter, you usually have one verse given to each of those people of great faith. Moses is given, the great Moses, 6 verses. Abraham's given 12 verses. I mean, he is the father of the faithful. All right, so when we think about it, he is going to be given the promise that he'll have a great nation, but his wife Sarah is barren. That had to stretch his faith. He's going to be given a great land, and yet it says the Canaanites are in the land, verse 6 in chapter 13 and verse 7. And he must leave everything he knows. He must leave all of his culture, his family, his country, all behind, and wander about basically in tents as a Bedouin the rest of his days. In verse 2, the promise says, I will make you a great nation. Again, we've already talked about that. The promise, of course, is going to be the Israelite nation, and that will come to pass later in the story. I will bless you, he goes on to say in verse 2. In Genesis, this is usually seen in progeny and in material wealth. Abram's already a wealthy man, verse 5, but he will grow even more wealthy. By the time we get to chapter 14, he will have 318 trained troops, servants that are warriors, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But he is going to become even greater than he is, and he will indeed one day have a son that comes from him and Sarah. I will make your name great, not just in fame, but in the ancient Near East, this is the high social esteem that he would be held in by others, his character. You think about the 3 great religions in this world. Judaism holds him as the father of their race. Christianity holds him as the father of the faithful. And Islam, many of the peoples that make up Islam, the religion Islam, hold him as the father that they descended from, which we will see later in the sons of Keturah and Ishmael and so forth, that the modern Arabic nations have descended from. So he is held in high esteem. He will entreat leaders of nations. He'll deal with Pharaoh. He will deal with Abimelech of the Philistines. Even the Hittites that surround him at Hebron, at the Oaks of Mamre, one of those Hittites, they call him a prince. You are like a prince among us in chapter 23 and verse 6. So that you, God goes on to say, will be a blessing. And that is, Abraham is not just a recipient, but he will be a transmitter. And especially, of course, that means that through the Messiah, that all nations of the earth will be blessed. At verse 3, he says, I will bless those that bless you, and those that dishonor you, I will curse. So to do that to Abraham was to do that to God. And God will deal with them directly. And we'll see that even in the story today, how God will let Abraham, with a very small force, defeat 5 kings and bring back great possessions and people. In you, all the families of the earth, verse 3, will be blessed, and we've talked about that already. But at verse 4 and 5, I want you to note he has no son of his own. So Abram went out as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And Lot's his nephew, as you remember, the son of Haran, his brother. And so Lot presumably is Abraham's heir. I think that's what the text is trying to indicate to us. Obviously, he's going to be the one through whom Terah's lineage will go. If Abraham dies childless, then it'll have to continue through Lot. Lot, we know, will have daughters. We'll learn that later. And we also learned in Mesopotamian law things that have been found it was written on clay. Thank goodness they were baked, and therefore they've not changed through time, has not worn them away, and the language was deciphered. And we're able to understand a lot of the customs that were prevalent at the time of Abraham. One of them was that a heirless man could adopt someone to be his son. And it appears that Lot serves that purpose, because later when Lot separates from him, remember that when God will, of course, tell him Isaac is coming, he says, well, my chief steward is my heir. So apparently Abraham had made him that according to his customs and the laws that he was used to. But God said, no, a son from you and Sarah will be your heir. And then no sooner does he arrive, and all this that we've just looked at, in verse 10 says there was a famine in the land. Now, Canaan is watered not by the river like the Nile River flooding in Egypt, and that certainty every year that they pretty well will have a crop. It's watered in the land of Palestine or Canaan by the rains of heaven. So sometimes droughts would come, and great severe droughts, as it's described here, and the more safer food supply was in Egypt. God doesn't intervene here. Abraham decides to go there for safety. He doesn't stop Abraham's move. Abraham doesn't seem to inquire of God, which would have seemed like the wise thing to do. God will later prevent Isaac from doing the same thing in a famine. A famine will happen. He will even mention what Abraham did in 26 verses 1 and 2, and Isaac will obey God. He will stay in the land, and God will take care of him. In fact, it seems to then be so firmly set because of the disaster that's going to happen to Abraham when he goes to Egypt, that Jacob has to be urged by God. Later we will find out in a dream, if I remember the account correctly already, that Jacob will need urging from God to leave Canaan and go to Egypt. In verses 11 and 12, because Sarah is a very beautiful, must have been strikingly beautiful woman, he says, tell them you are my sister or they'll kill me and take you. And so she goes along with this. Now, it was a half-truth. They had the same father, but not the same mother, chapter 20 and verse 12. That may seem, of course, very weird to us, that a man would marry even his half-sister. And while that would be illegal today, and it would have could have genetic ramifications, in this day it did not, and you can do a lot of other study to find that out, and it certainly did not have the unlawfulness. It was not looked at that way, and many times you see it happening, and you'll see it again in some of the story of marrying kin. Isaac will marry kin. Jacob will marry kin, and that may seem very, very weird to us, but wasn't so in their culture. It's possible that the Hurrian influence of Haran, that a husband we know there could legally adopt his wife as his sister. And that may be what he's doing here, because it appears that a brother had the say over who married a sister. And that may have been what Abram's trying to accomplish here. We know Laban, for instance, had to speak of whether Rebekah could go and marry Isaac. In chapter 24, Jacob, remember his sons, had to do that same thing with Dinah. Remember, they take the lead, not Jacob there. Laban takes the lead, not Rebekah, or not their father. And if he was alive, we don't know some of those things. But nonetheless, the law that we know that existed in Iran, Laban and Jacob, and this story might indicate that. Perhaps Abraham hoped that he would have the right to reject whoever, but Pharaoh takes notice of her. Princes of Egypt bring that to Pharaoh, and here's the king of the land, and so he takes her as his sister, and he believes that he is doing nothing wrong by doing that. But the real relationship was Abraham was married to her, and this was adultery, and it could not be excused in Pharaoh, even if it was done on his part in honor. But it was sin nonetheless, and sin is not excused even in ignorance. Now, how Pharaoh discovered the connection between his house suffers great plagues, we do not know. Wenheim notes that skin diseases, and that's what the word means here, great plagues were used later to describe skin diseases in Leviticus 13, the word that's used here. They were looked at as a consequence of great sin, so that may have pervaded throughout the cultures of that time. And so he calls Abraham to him at verse 18 and says, "What is this that you have done to me?" He knows that he has been wrong. Here's Abraham, the patriarch, the father of the faithful, the one called by God through whom the Messiah will come, receiving moral rebuke, well deserved, we might add, from a polytheistic pagan who neither believed in God nor worshiped the one true and living God. And that will not be the only time we will see this happening. And it's a lesson that we can learn. Sometimes we behave in such ways as God's people that those in the world have to rebuke us, and it never goes well when that happens. There's no word recorded from Abraham's mouth. He seems to be silent and accept it. In fact, Pharaoh says, "I took her as wife." And many have commented on that, and I think they are correct, that it's unlikely that Sarah was taken into Pharaoh's house without consummation, so that adultery would have happened. And that would have been a great sin, even to the other peoples, even to, as Pharaoh understands, as others we will find. Abimelech will understand that later. We'll have the same thing happen in that story. And yet he deals well with Abram. And of course, that comes out of that blessing that God said, "I will bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you." And the plagues had fallen on Pharaoh's house, obviously because of it being a great wrong to Abraham. And so he is sent packing, and off they go back to Canaan. When they come to Canaan in chapter 13, they pass through the southern region, the Negev, and we'll talk about that at the end of this. I'll point things out to you on the map. They go as far as Bethel, the place they had been at the beginning, where he had first made an altar. And it says at verse 4, "And there Abram called on the name of the Lord." Now that thing is also said, called on the name of the Lord, back earlier in chapter 12. And what that seems to mean is, if you go forward in the story of 1 Kings chapter 18, you will see that in that pitting of Elijah against the false prophets of Baal, that they are to first both set a slaughter on a sacrifice on stones that they have set up for an altar, and then they're to cry upon the God. You cry upon Baal to send fire to consume your sacrifice. I'll call upon Yahweh, the true and living God, to send fire. And of course, you know the story there. But he talks about that when they set up, when Elijah says, when he set up the sacrifice, I'll call upon the name of Yahweh. And so there is worship attached to that sacrifice being offered for the forgiveness of their sins at that time, the blood that had to be shed, and the worship of the one true and living God who alone can forgive sins. And so this idea of calling upon God is connected always, you see, with the setting up of those altars. All right, so in chapter 13, it will always be the pattern. They are a Bedouin people. They pick up their tents and they move, but they leave these altars behind. Later on, other patriarchs will come and follow them and find the altar that one of their forefathers made, and will build it up again and sacrifice unto the one true and living God on it. And then we read in this story, chapter 13, of great strife occurring between Lot and Abram's herdsmen. They had great flocks and possessions, both of them. So trying to maintain the land, not not interpose upon the Canaanites that dwelt in the land. Finally, they have to do something about it. And so Abram calls Lot and says, let there be no strife between me and you, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. And so is not the whole land before you. You choose. If you go to the right hand, I'll go to the left. So it's a marvelous thing that Abraham does. He's older. He's the uncle of Lot. I mean, it's possible that they could have been the same age. I have an uncle who's only 4 years older than me. Some have suggested that in their writings that they might have been about the same age. But nonetheless, Abram's the superior. And he's the one that graciously says to Lot, you choose. And here is what is very indicative in the story. That Lot is going to separate from Abraham, and no more mention is going to be made about him from the standpoint of there being somehow he's looked at as the heir. And it also tells you something, even though the Bible will call Lot a righteous man, it will say in this chapter that Abraham dwelt in Canaan. It's Lot that looked down in the valley, saw that well-watered plain like the Nile in Egypt, and he went down to the cities of that valley. And Sodom is mentioned there, and it is called they were great sinners and wicked before God. So that Lot chooses that way, and Abram chooses the land that God said is yours. You looked at it. Lot didn't look to that. He looked and he went, and in that I think the Bible is trying to say to us something about that separation, that no more would Lot be considered in any way to be, and of course God never intended that, even though Abraham may have been looking at it that way. Then at that point is when Yahweh renews the covenant. Notice it, verse 14, and the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look at the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also shall be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So though he never owned any piece of it except the cave of Machpelah that he would buy later to bury Sarah in, still in effect, God says, it's yours. I'm giving you. Walk the boundary of it. That again was a Mesopotamian, an ancient culture that they would walk around the perimeter of land when they bought a piece of property to establish that it was theirs. It had the legal binding. We even know that surveyors come out and drive their surveyor stakes to indicate a plot of land. You're the land where your house is sitting. Was so surveyed so that belongs to you. We understand the perimeters and the edges of the property. And so God is saying to him, basically, you walk anywhere in Canaan, walk the length and breadth of it. I've given it to you and to your offspring to inherit. And so it tells us that Abram went and moved his tent and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and that'll be the name that we will know that place by, and it will come to play a role in Joshua and Caleb's day. It plays a role in King David's day. Very important place. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So everywhere that you see Abraham go, he builds an altar to worship God. Again, understanding in that day and age that fathers, the patriarchs, served as priests to their families. And then we come to chapter 14, and we are told about 5 kings. Remember where I showed you in that Fertile Crescent of where Elam is, and one of the kings is mentioned from being there. So that's right at the tip of the Persian Gulf, right in that land that was called Mesopotamia, the very south part of that Fertile Crescent, between the Euphrates and the Tigris. Apparently these 5 kings, Elam was shown on the map, come from that area. They have put Sodom and Gomorrah and the other 5 cities. It wasn't uncommon for a city its ruler to be called a king in this day. They were king over the villages, of course, that surrounded that area land that was considered theirs, but it would have been much smaller. We would call them city-states, even like the Greeks had when we think of Athens and some of those city-states later in history. I won't try to pronounce all the names, but just to tell you that those kings came because they had put Sodom and Gomorrah and those sister cities in the valley under tribute to them. And they had served those kings for a long time, 12 years, but then they rebelled. And so the kings come and they attack and they prevail and they carry away a lot of people and possessions. And as they head north, which is usually the way, remember that Fertile Crescent, they're going to come not across Arabia, and so he's heading back after this destruction that he's wreaked on Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're told that an escapee came at verse 13 to Abram the Hebrew. So this is the first time, and the only place, I might add, where Abram is referred to by his race. Extra biblical writings of this time refer to Haran and other places like that as having a people called the Habaru. And you can hear how that sounds like our word Hebrew, or the word Hebrew in the Bible. And it's most likely the same people. So verse 14 says that Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, and that's his one concern. He led forth his trained men, the English Standard says, in his house, 318 of them who had been born in his house. Now imagine how great this man is. These are not, as Hamilton has written, they are not shepherds who grabbed a spear or a sling and headed north for some 125 miles before they did battle. These are men trained to be warriors. That's what they do for Abraham. They were born in his house. They were trained to defend his house as warriors because, again, think of the great possessions he had. And God, of course, will take care of him, but we must do what we can do too. And that is what Abraham has done. He has these men. So imagine how many servants he must have had, maybe into the thousands, that were beyond these men that did all other kinds of things. So he is a very great man. They defeated them at verse 15. As one man said, no foreign king can exercise powers against the blessing of God. Remember, if you raise your hand against Abraham, God's going to raise his hand against you. I'll curse the person who does so. And so Abraham defeats them, and God protects him. So on the way back, very important man meets them. Now, two kings come out, the king of Sodom, and there is a very contrast here. And the king that is called the king of Salem, Melchizedek. Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and he is called also something else very significant, priest of God Most High. Now, Salem is what we will come to know as Jerusalem, right? And you see the Salem part of it. And Jerusalem will stand for the Jebusites. Remember, in David's day, we just studied about that, and David delivered the city out of the Jebusites' control. And sometimes even in the Bible, you'll have only it referred to as Salem. For instance, Psalm 76 and verse 2. Very rarely after that, but times there are. There are Salem place names in the United States because of our biblical heritage. All right, so Melchizedek comes out, and he brings oil, and he brings bread and wine, a great feast, obviously, feed the people, feed the victors. He blesses Abraham, and as the Hebrew author will argue from this in chapter 7, we're not going to bring all of that in here, but that he's a great man to be studied and understood by his connection, particularly in the book of Hebrews. He's also in Psalms 110 and verse 4, because the priesthood of Jesus will be after the order of Melchizedek. And Abraham recognizes him, understands who he is. This is what he says to Abram. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And in this day and age, we know from the writings of the Mesopotamian world in that time, the ancient Near East, that it was common for the tenth to be given. Let me read it from Kyle and Delitzsch's commentary. Giving the tenth was a practical acknowledgement of the divine priesthood of Melchizedek, but the tenth was, according to general custom, the offering presented to the deity. Remember that God would tell Abraham, the cup of the Amorites' iniquity is not yet full. The Amorites meaning the Canaanites. They're still godly men like Melchizedek. It's hard for us to see that in a greater story, but obviously he was king of Salem, king of Jerusalem at this time, and priest of God Most High. And so that means that Abraham and him both worship the one true and living God. And when Abram then is accosted by, or has his confrontation with the king of Sodom then says, you take all the possessions and just give me the people back. And he doesn't, it's almost like he's giving orders to Abraham. And it's Abraham who Melchizedek comes out and blesses and brings an offering, brings things, food and wine to them. Sodom brings nothing. Almost like demanding, here's what you'll do. You take everything. And Abraham will have nothing to do with Sodom. The kind of character of the man, who they were, how wicked they were. He said, I would not take a thread of a sandal strap, something as little as that, or anything of yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. He probably knew exactly what kind of character that he was dealing with. But he began that talk to Sodom king of Sodom with, I've lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. It is God that rules over creation. It is God that rules over kings, as he defeated the five that Abraham went against to deliver Lot. And it's God that will defeat Sodom and Gomorrah one day, not very far down the road. And so as we end this section, we come to Abraham returning back to Hebron, where he has, of course, in this story also some Hittite allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. And you remember that he dwells at the Oaks of Mamre, which are called Hebron. All right, I was going to present to you the map that I sent to you, and just so that you know the place name. So let's show it on the screen. All right. So the bottom circle that I had you draw, of course, is the Ur of the Chaldees. Mari is where a lot of texts have been discovered about the peoples of that time. Haran is this northern thing. And so all of that area that you think between the river, near the river Euphrates, is what we would call modern day Iraq. Right, they're going to make their way around the Fertile Crescent down into the land of Palestine. So because this is so tiny and small, you need to look at the inset. So he comes first in chapter 12 to Shechem. He enters crossing the Jordan River and Shechem. And remember, that'll play a role in the story of Jacob. And then he comes to Bethel next. Bethel meaning the house of God. Remember that if you think about the contrast, Lot goes to the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham stays in the land of Canaan at the house of God, is what Bethel. Bethel, of course, is the later name. It's known as Luz in the days of the Canaanites, but Bethel is what we need to remember. And then Jerusalem is right below that. Of course, that's where Melchizedek came out of. And then Mamre, this is, of course, a square box on your map. And, of course, that's to indicate the cave of Machpelah, where he bought the land. And, of course, Hebron is what we know that is where he will spend a lot of time. And then Beersheba. Beersheba is your final place that you needed to mark. And Beersheba is a place you'll also see. This whole southern region is called the Negev, the Negev or Negeb, and it means the southern area or dry, arid. It's come to stand for the south. And so we know it as the tribe of Judah. Everything that was west of the Dead Sea would later be the tribe of Judah. All right, so I hope that's helpful to you and that you know. You can email me questions, call me if you want to talk, if you have some comment that would be good to make. I know this is just like a one-way conversation. But anyway, I hope it helps us. It's the best we can do during this time while we're having to deal with the coronavirus. Again, thank you for listening, and you can email me questions. We'll have more handouts and things like that I'll send. Questions will come on Sundays. I'll send those out to you for the following Wednesday, so you have them on Monday and Tuesday to study. God bless you.